Good afternoon, everybody. Please turn off your cell phones. I am Cappy Powell, the president of the Johann Fust Library Foundation board. The mission of our board is twofold. The first is to maintain and preserve the buildings and gardens. Last year, Hurricane Ian left the library, like most of us, with some challenges. Last November, we could not be in this garden. By January, enough repairs had been done that we could be back, but not all the hurricane damage was fixed. Over the summer, while most of us were at our summer homes, our wonderful foundation staff members were here working hard to oversee the remaining hurricane repairs and the normal summer capital repairs and jobs, like repainting, staining, cleaning, termite tinting, and landscaping. Just look how beautiful the garden is. It has been a challenging year for our staff, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge them. Deanna Martin, over there. Juliana, over there. And Bobbie Marquis. The second part of our mission statement, which is tied into the first, is to provide a literary and cultural center for the residents and visitors of Boca Grande. Welcome to the first program of our 2023-24 season. I am very excited about this year's lineup, of speakers, which wouldn't be possible they were recommended by our program committee, but again, none of this would be possible without our wonderful staff, especially our executive director, Bobbie Marquis. If you have not seen it yet, please pick up a copy of our publication, Island Book Notes, which has information about our literary series events and also includes book reviews, poetry, and essays by local writers. Today, I am thrilled to have with us David Von Drehle to kick off our literary series. Those of you who know me know that I'm a Virginian by birth, but a proud Kansas Citian by marriage, and no, I'm not going to talk about football right now. As you might know, last year, as part of our literary series, you heard from Lindsay Major about our wonderful art gallery, the Nelson Art Gallery in Kansas City. But we also have one of only 15 presidential libraries overseen by the National Archives, the Harry S. Truman Library. I was fortunate enough to serve on the Library Institute board with David Von Drehle, and also with our sponsors today, John and Marnie Sherman. When I first met David, he was editor-at-large for Time magazine, where he wrote more than 60 cover stories. He had been at the Washington Post before Time, and he has returned to the Post, where he now lives in Kansas City and works as an opinion columnist, writing on a wide range of topics. Just a couple weeks ago, David wrote a column about the death of the Friends actor, Matthew Perry, and about the high cost of fame. I have long wanted David to speak on the island. He has written several award-winning nonfiction books. One, Triangle, The Fire That Changed America, is a detailed account of the fire at the Triangle Shirt Factory in 1911 in New York City. It is such a compelling story with personal accounts of the victims, most of whom were young, very young immigrants, working long hours for very low wages and sending most of those home to their families in their native countries. It was published in 2004. Little was known about the fire victims. David found the historical record appalling and set out to at least give the victims their names again. His book prompted others to dig further. Last month, 21 years later after his book, on October 11th, the Triangle Fire Memorial to the victims and the legacy of the Shirtwaist Factory fire was dedicated. The memorial tells the story in the languages spoken by the victims, English, Yiddish, and Italian. As David wrote, history becomes irresistible when sympathy connects us with the past. And David does a beautiful job doing just that. In our Island Book Notes, you will find a review by Lee Major of David's 2012 book, Rise to Greatness, Abraham Lincoln's America's Most Perilous Year. President Lincoln guided this nation through a perilous year, as did our President Truman. In June, when the Book of Charlie was published, I sent a copy to Bobbie with a note saying, I'd love to have David in our loggia to talk about Charlie. John and Marnie Sherman helped me make that happen, and I cannot thank them enough. John's father recently passed away, and John and Marnie are in Colorado with their family this week. But I'm pleased to welcome Mary's sister, Marnie's sister, Beth Allen, who is with us today. David, I don't know who's more excited about you being here, me or Bobbie. Bobbie has, I think, read everything you've written and probably watched every interview. I am looking forward to having you in conversation with Bobbie Marquis. Welcome, David.
Excellent introduction.
That was really special she did it just the way I wrote it for her. And Cappy is, as you know, a treasure. And one of so many good things have happened to me since we moved to Kansas City, but meeting Cappy is high on the list, along with Beth, my dear friends and hosts today, John and Marnie, who I wish were here. But it's just a delight to be with you in this beautiful space. And Bobbie, thank you for bringing me.
Thank you, David. It's wonderful to have you here. And Cappy, as Cappy said, I've read almost everything you've written, but I have to confess, I'm sure you've written a lot more than what I've read. But your writing inspires me because it's deep, but it's very natural and easy to follow. And I feel like you're always telling a story. And it's the stories of life. And it seems as though when you write, you're like a student of the human condition. And I really admired that.
Thank you.
So the Book of Charlie, it's a little book, but you packed a lot in there, David. So how about if we start by you telling us all about your experience when you met Charlie?
Sure. So my wife and I were both Washington, D.C. journalists, political writers. We met on a presidential campaign in 1992, and we started a family, and that sort of got out of hand rather quickly. And we woke up one day with our fourth baby was there, and our oldest was 5 years old. I won't go into the details of that, but it was harrowing with many twists and turns. And so Karen, who had also contracted a chronic disability as well, these took her out of the workforce. And suddenly we were a single newspaperman income family of 6 in Washington, D.C., which was going to pose some challenges for us. At just that moment, Time magazine approached me to take a writing position with them. And to sweeten the pot, they said, you can live anywhere you want to live. And so we found an easier place to live, Kansas City. That was my wife's hometown, although I think sometimes I'm more enthusiastic about being there than she is. She says, I spent the first 18 years of my life trying to get out of here. But the boomerang effect is well known in Kansas City, where people come back to raise their kids. So there we were. It was 2007. It was August. It was blazingly hot. And I went outside. The first Sunday morning we were in our house, still full of packing boxes, and to get the newspaper from the driveway. And many in this group will remember that experience of newspapers in driveways.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was halfway down my driveway. I looked up, and there was my new neighbor out in his driveway wearing just a pair of old swim trunks. He was very handsome, strikingly handsome fellow, very buff, big barrel chest, floppy hair in his eyes. He had a garden hose in one hand, a sponge in the other, and he was washing his girlfriend's car on Sunday morning. And I couldn't help but notice that the car was in exactly the same spot where I had seen it the night before when she came over, which made me realize that he was getting more action than I was at that point. But striking as this scene was, the most amazing thing was he had just turned 102 years old.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah.
102.
And even a specimen like that, at 102, you meet them. I mean, I was eager. I was like, I need to get to know this guy. You don't think you're starting a long-term friendship. But in fact, that was the beginning of a 7-year friendship that I had with Charlie White. It was a genuine friendship where he was as interested in me as I was in him. He had a remarkable gift for making new friends, which, as all of us age, we realize is more and more important, because anybody who's lucky enough to live to an age like that, if you don't keep making friends, you're going to be all by yourself.
Yeah.
Charlie outlived not only all his original friends, but a lot of their kids. So that was the genesis of the Book of Charlie.
Wow, what a great first impression.
Yes.
And then from there, you got to know him. And what made you decide to sit down and write this book, David?
Well, I'm going to confess something here that will make you think less of me as a journalist. It never crossed my mind to write a book about Charlie White while he was alive. And it seems pretty obvious that he was good material, and I should have been taking notes and all that. But it was going back to this thing. That it was a genuine friendship, and I wasn't working when I was with him, and I wasn't, it's dangerous to be related to a writer or friends with a writer, because everything is material for us, everything.
Yeah.
But I try to respect, my friends' privacy, at least until they're dead. After Charlie was gone, my kids were, by that point, entering their teen years, starting to look like young adults. I was thinking more and more about what their lives were going to be like and what I could maybe give them of value. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me that my life story was not quite right to be a role model for them. They're entering a period of unimaginable change and dynamic innovation, and probably going to drive, not just the normal changing gadgets that we all grew up with, where the transistor radio eventually became the iPhone, but all through our lives, we've been listening to music out of little handheld boxes. No, this is going to be huge change. Yeah. And for that, the role model would be someone who was born before the automobile age, in the days of horses and buggies, who lived to see tire tracks on Mars, someone born at the very dawn of air travel. The same year Charlie was born was also the first year that Wilbur Wright took what we would think of as a real airplane flight. They had gone to Kitty Hawk in 1903, and they'd flown about 100 yards down the beach. They didn't know where they'd take off. They didn't know where they'd land. But by 1905, they'd been back to their workshop in Ohio. They'd perfected some things, and Wilbur Wright took a plane up, flew in a 24-mile circle, and landed right where he wanted to land. That's the birth of of flight. Charlie was alive when that happened, and he lived to see people living on the International Space Station.
Yeah.
He was born before radio, lived to own an iPhone. The great conflicts of the 20th century, the upheavals, the social revolutions of civil rights, women's rights, all of this he had experienced, and not only experienced but thrived through. And it hit me after he was gone that this is the story that I want to write for my kids. How do you maintain your equanimity, yourself, your confidence, your contentment, your purpose through periods of huge upheaval, uncertainty, and change?
And the way that Charlie approached life is something that you took a lot of inspiration from. But yet he was not really, he didn't profess to be a philosopher himself, from what you have said.
You know, when people hear that he had no idea that I would write a book, the follow-up question often is, well, what would he think about this? And I'm pretty sure he would like having his stories preserved because he knew they were good stories. He knew he told them well. He loved telling them. He would be very surprised to be in the middle of a lot of philosophy as well, because he denied he had a life philosophy. If he was really pushed, he would say, well, my mother always told us do the right thing. Personally, I think that's not a bad philosophy, and in fact a lot better than the one that seems so popular today of do the wrong thing. But Charlie wasn't a talking philosopher. He was a living philosophy lesson. Mm-hmm. Because what I realized about him was that the wisdom that various teachers, both living and in books, had been trying to teach me over and over again since I was a kid, Charlie exemplified it, and that's the philosophy of Stoicism. Stoicism has a terrible PR department. It really needs a rebranding because people generally use it to mean repressed, buttoned up, unemotional, even uncaring. But what the ancient Greeks and Romans, for them, Stoicism was the opposite. It was a liberating philosophy. It was a philosophy of happiness and of purpose. And it taught one basic idea, or it all stemmed from this basic concept that in our lives, there's a great deal that we don't control. We don't control other people. Anybody who's raised teenagers knows that, or been married, right? So we don't control other people. We don't control, obviously, the weather. We don't control the government. We don't control what fate is going to bring us. You know, terrible setbacks, diseases, accidents, all these things, challenges. Everybody in this room knows that they come uninvited. We don't control them. Mm-hmm. We control one thing, which the classical philosophers called the product of our will. Or just think of it as we control the way we face the world, the face we present to others. Do we interact with people with kindness? Do we assume good faith in other people? Do we try to build up the world or tear it down? Do we decide to find beauty in a life that has a lot of unbeautiful things in it. You know, these are the products of our will. What goals do we set for ourselves? What do we try to accomplish? What do we try to add to our communities, to our families, to the world? That we control. And the secret to happiness, contentment, a purposeful life, however you frame it, is observing that difference. And Charlie was a master of it and a great teacher for me by example. I had tried to do it from, the head many times in my life, and I just find myself falling back, backsliding. Why am I always in the longest line, slowest line at the grocery store, But Charlie just exuded it, and I gained a lot by seeing it done by a master.
And in the story of Charlie, there really is a point in his life very early where he becomes other than a child.
Yeah.
At age 8, right?
Yeah, I think it's the day that started Charlie on his stoic path, because he was 8 years old, new to Kansas City, and he left for school, 3rd grade, in the morning with a dad and a mom and 4 sisters and a nice house and, that sort of perfect life. And by the time he got home, his father was dead in a freak accident. His mother had no means of support. She had no job. They had to figure out immediately, as a family, how were they going to support themselves, convert their home into a boarding house where all the kids had to pitch in. His whole life just turned upside down. And if that doesn't, that could knock somebody totally off kilter. But in Charlie's case, he found his way through and developed resilience in the face of trauma, and that built confidence. And he was never again going to think, well, I'm in control of everything that happens to me.
He had to grow up really fast.
He had to grow up fast.
And his mother, she was really not an overprotective parent, to the contrary.
My wife and I were such helicopter parents.
I can relate.
Oh my God. And I know that we overdid it. Laura White did not overdo it at all. She had great confidence in Charlie, which built his confidence in himself. My mother erred more on the benign neglect side of the. She had 6 kids, so she had no choice. But and I can look back in my life and relate to that. That by being allowed to get into scrapes and finding my way back out of them, that built self-confidence. And maybe bubble wrapping our kids was not quite, we meant well, but.
Well, I thought it was really kind of funny that when he was jumping on trolleys and hitching a ride on trolleys, and they stopped at the house and said, you've got to do something about this child, she tied him up to the porch, right?
3 years old, he was jumping on the trolley cars as they went by to ride on the fender of the car.
Yeah.
And the conductor said, you got to get this kid under control. And they didn't have Ritalin in those days, right? So she tied him to the porch. Said, I'm going to tie you up just like I tie the milk cow.
Yeah. Well, and by having the rooming house after the death of his father, the mother is taking in boarders, and as it turns out, this experience of meeting a range of men has influenced him.
Huge influence on him. He had great respect for the men who would rent rooms in the house. It was a very different housing culture in those days. people didn't really live in a house by themselves or an apartment by themselves. It was much more common that people took a room in what were called boarding houses. And so these were, he talked about the circulation manager for the Kansas City Star, lived with them for a while. They were a frequent stop for doctors on their way to missionary doctors. And these were the men they really latched onto, were these doctors. And he fell in love with the idea of becoming one himself, and did.
Yeah.
He found his career at the breakfast table.
And the practice of medicine, I mean, what was the year when he would have gone to med school?
1923.
And the world then?
Totally different. Totally different. This was one of the most fascinating parts of the writing experience for me, was getting in touch with 1920s medicine. And I had a front row seat because Charlie kept all his life his notebook from the capstone class. It was called pathology, but it was basically just a lickety-split review of all the parts of the body, all the organs, all the diseases, and 0 cures.
Yeah.
You know, Charlie would say, we didn't know how to cure anything. And they had sort of suggested you might try this, and a shocking number of illnesses, they suggested mercury in some solution or other. You know, of course, this is one of the most toxic substances on earth, you know, but use it for everything. Taking the tonsils out was considered some sort of magical thing, not just for, you know, swollen or, you know, respiratory problems that we still take tonsils out for, but all sorts of diseases and complaints and maladies. They'd say, take out the tonsils, if nothing else. But this was before penicillin, and this was before the endotracheal tube. So any surgery in the main trunk of the body was impossible, because as soon as you would open the body up, the lungs would collapse and the patient would die. So they were very limited on what they could do. They were kind of like wellness coaches, we'd call them now. They were grief counselors. If they went into a home and felt like the patient was probably going to die, they would start to prepare the family and even the patient for that possibility. And a lot of them were quacks. I mean, there were some crazy, nutty. You'll be amazed at what some people paid to have done to themselves in the 20s and 30s. So that's what he learned, and that's how he started his career. He finished med school and residency just in time for the Great Depression. So he started building a medical practice at the most difficult time in American history to try to become a doctor.
Wow. And so it was a lot of barter then to try for the patients to try to get treated.
Yeah, he estimated that 40% of his patients ultimately didn't pay him a cent. And about 20% were able to pay him in money. $3 for a clinic visit, $5 for a house call. And the other 40%, it was barter. You know, he said if you treated the guy who owned the service station, you might get a free tank of gas. In one case, he treats a formerly wealthy lawyer who was completely bust for pneumonia, and the guy paid him with a set of encyclopedias that he happened to own. So Charlie kept those encyclopedias the rest of his life, loved showing them off, but I think he would have preferred to have had money.
Well, and some of the incidents that you describe in the book, the kind of treatments, for example, the time he improvised on removing someone's tonsils with wire.
He loved that story. So most of his work, including surgery, was done in the home. So he'd have his, the classic leather doctor bag that you've seen in movies, and it would be packed up by, usually at the hospital. There was a nursing corps that would supply the bags, and off he'd go. So he was going on yet another tonsillectomy in this story, and when he got there, got the kid, put him on the dining room table, which is where he did most of his surgeries. He would train a person in the family who he thought, on first impression, was the most kind of stable person there. He would teach them how to administer the anesthetic, the ether.
Yeah.
So he'd get this person set up, teach him how to drip the ether on the cotton, so it'd be breathed through the mask. And they had the kid under, and the person was dripping the ether, and Charlie goes into his bag, and the tool he needs is not there. It was called a snare. I didn't realize how they take tonsils out. I figured it was with a knife. But they have a snare that is a loop of wire. They loop it around the tonsil, they pull it, and the wire cuts out the tonsil. So, I'm sorry if I'm grossing people out. But he didn't have it, and now he's like, what, I'm going to wake up the kid and leave, go home, come back. I'm going to have a heck of a time getting this kid back on this table. And so he looks around the room and notices a picture on the wall and thinks, that's hanging by a piece of wire. He takes the picture off the wall, takes the wire off the picture, sterilizes it in a candle flame, feeds it into his snare, and takes out the tonsils with picture wire.
And of course, those were the days before malpractice.
Obviously. As Charlie put it, this was before the sting of the lawyers.
Yeah. And there were all kinds of stories like that he told you.
Oh, yeah.
It just must have been so fascinating to sit with him and hear these stories from a completely different time.
Well, I'll tell you, just since we're on tonsils, because it's so exemplary of Charlie's sort of approach to life. He was in his residency, and it was a Saturday morning, and he and the other residents were all summoned to the all-important first tonsillectomy. This is going to be their go-to treatment for everything they see. So now they're going to see one done for the first time in an operating room. And they get there, and the surgeon says, boys, because they were all men in those days, boys, I'm sorry our patient didn't show up. So we're going to have to cancel and wait for the next one. And Charlie says, I still have mine. And the surgeon sort of like, what? And he says, you can take my tonsils out. So he climbs up on the table, takes his jacket off, climbs up on the table, opens his mouth. They put a mirror in front of his face so he can watch too and get his training as well. And he's wide awake, has his tonsils cut out.
Wow, he was really an interesting person. But the times were interesting. And I love the way you've done this with the book, that you're really telling us Charlie's story, but we're also learning a lot about the way people lived through the last 109 years that he was alive. and so much change.
Yeah.
And what I found inspiring was the discussion that you had about revolutionary change versus incremental change, and the way we live every day versus when you look at when big change happens.
Yeah. Well, I think we're teed up, and I think we've already begun into the rapids of a period of revolutionary change. And it's all, basically this thing right here and all the implications of it. And what I compare it to is the Gutenberg's revolution of movable type. It was a different time and age, but before movable type, people didn't really learn more than their parents and their village knew, because information was passed along mainly word of mouth. All of a sudden, people could be connected to information across great distances, but also across time. And things that were written about in the 1500s could suddenly provoke a discovery or an advance 200 years later, because another scientists were able to talk to each other.
Yeah.
They were able to record their discoveries and preserve them and share them. Well, what were the follow-on effects of movable type? The Reformation, the end of monarchies, really, the rise of democracy, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the urbanization revolution. All of these things flow out of this ability to distribute information. Human civilization suddenly speeds up. Change becomes infinitely more powerful. And it changes the way people live, the way they worship, the way their communities are organized. Families shrunk, as farming became more efficient. People didn't need as many field hands, which is how they often thought of kids. The fact that families shrunk slowly, gradually liberated women to start to think about doing other things. People didn't need to be literate before movable type. Suddenly they did. And so schools were invented. The university was no longer just training a handful of priests. Suddenly it was training, future scientists, future teachers, all these things that we take for granted really trace back to that one revolution.
Yeah, yeah.
And now we're putting the power of mass communication in every single person's hand. This thing is a TV station, it's a library, it's a computer, it's
Well, and artificial intelligence
is gonna, yeah.
It's profound.
So this is what I mean about, you can't predict what the changes are going to be. I can't prepare my kids for what's going to come. I have no idea where it's going to go. But I can say, here's how you do it with equanimity, with yourself intact, without fear, and maybe even with joy.
Yeah. So as profound as the changes that we're facing, this story actually helps us to see a man who has lived through profound change and kept his humor.
Yeah.
And
and the other thing, what I hope, and I'm getting some lovely feedback from readers, that in this unsettled time that we're living in, politically unsettled, culturally unsettled, obviously the world seems like it's fallen apart right now. Charlie's life, what he saw, what he did, reminds us that we've been through these things before.
Yeah.
You know, we just came out of a pandemic, right? Charlie lived through a pandemic in 1918, 1919. People were protesting quarantines and mask requirements back then, just like in our time. We talk about the division, political division we lived through. Peter and I were talking about this at lunch. We're no more divided in the 2020s than we were in the 1920s. Terribly, bitterly divisive time in American history when, you know, I'm from Colorado, I live in Kansas now. Both those states were governed by open members of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. We forget this stuff. We're very good at being happy in the rearview mirror as Americans, and you know, kind of nervous as we look forward. But you know, disrupted world. I mean, the world's never been more disrupted than World War II, the worst time ever. Economic uncertainty. I mean, Charlie lived through the Great Depression, when 25% of people were out of work and 33% of GDP was wiped out. And the message of that, to me, should be not that these are not concerns, don't worry about them, forget about them, but that we've come through it before in the past, and we can come through it again.
Yeah.
Because America's a nation of Charlies. He's extraordinary in his age, but he's very ordinary in many ways. He's a regular guy. And America's a nation of Charlies, basically. People who get up and try to be constructive, try to add to our communities, try to solve a problem or help somebody out with their problem.
Yeah. Well, David, one of the things I enjoy about your work is that it's very strong in the area of social history. And you get a feeling, like, for example, in Rise to Greatness, which I know we're talking mostly about Charlie today, but the book Rise to Greatness is a very profound study of Lincoln, and especially as he navigated through the grief of losing his son and how that influenced him while all these other crazy things were going on in his world.
Right.
Politically.
One of the things that I try to do in my work is to help readers understand that people in the past were people. You know, despite the funny clothes that they wore, or the herky-jerky way that they walk in movies, or the way that some of them are put on marble pedestals in temples in Washington, that they were people first and foremost. They slept or they couldn't sleep. Lincoln was a terrible insomniac. They had to eat. They had bad days, good days and bad days. They were not always at their best. And I find that the things that people do are, they come into clearer relief when you realize, oh, well, I get that, you know. In Lincoln's case, there's so many stories that you would read separately, you know, like that, oh, in this book about his sons, you would read that every Thursday for several months, his son Willie died on a Thursday. Lincoln would go sit in the room where his son died for about an hour. He couldn't be, not to be interrupted, and he would be with his grief. And then in another book, you might read of this story about the time that a young abolitionist treasury agent came into his office and started to tell him about an initiative to use slaves who had been enslaved people who had been abandoned on the Georgia coast, the Sea Isles, we put them to work, and that way they could make a living. We'd make schools for them. He was bubbling with all these ideas, and Lincoln just cut him off. When you realize that those two things happened next to each other, that Lincoln walked out of this intense grieving at the bed where his son had died, and the first thing he met was this chirpy little idealist from Harvard. Then the fact that he didn't handle it with his usual perfect aplomb, it suddenly makes a little sense. Oh yeah, well yeah, I can see how that would happen. In my book about the Triangle Fire, discovering that as the fire entered the factory, these mostly young women, late teens, early 20s, they were just getting off work, and they were all talking about what they were going to do that Saturday evening. They were going to meet their boyfriend. Some of them were singing a popular song, and that image of just these, late high school, early college age. I don't want to patronize them by calling them girls, but they were just being 20-year-old girls. Yeah. And at the moment when they saw the fire entering their workspace, that to me, is how history comes alive.
Yeah, that's what I love about your writing, David. And I'm wondering if anyone in the audience has any questions. Do you have any questions out there?
Can you take us through your writing approach? Do you like to write in the morning, or just what is your style?
Let's repeat the question.
Sure, I'll repeat the question. This is just asking about writing discipline, right? It's changed dramatically over my life. When I was young, I wrote mostly at night. And as life has crept up, I've found the best time is to get up early and write before the day starts. But my main, thing that I need is a deadline. I'm a terrible procrastinator. So what I try to do is persuade a publisher to pay me in advance for the book. And then when all that money is spent and there's no book, at that point I have a choice of paying back the advance with money that I no longer have, or writing the book. And I find that to be a wonderful concentrator of the mind. I'll share some other ones that I think are good. Don't ever have a writing space with a nice view, because you will be looking out the window a lot. I think it's Dean Koontz who he has his desk in a corner of his basement that is almost unbearable. Many writers, including some of the most productive I know, they have a set amount that they write each day. Bob Woodward, for example, writes 10 pages a day. And if it's going well, and he writes 10 pages in 2 hours, then he's got half a day off and he goes and plays golf or whatever. He doesn't try to write 20 that day. If it takes 12 hours or 15 hours to write those 10 pages, then he's at his desk that long. That kind of discipline is important. A lot of people expect book writing maybe to have some, I certainly did before I started doing it, have some glamour attached to it, but it's a very lonely, tedious work. You have to, there is no alternative to putting your rear on the chair and sitting there. But if you do sit there long enough, you know, one page adds up eventually to a whole book. Yeah, in Hemingway's manuscripts, I saw one once, and in little tiny type down this, you know, sorted through this, he hand wrote most of his manuscripts, you'd see a 23 or 71 or 119, and it dawned on me he was counting up how many words he had written that day and marking, you know, and there were days when he would write 29 words. That's hard work.
Yeah.
That is hard work.
Have you written any fiction, David?
No, I've tried fiction. My kids, I say at the beginning of the book, my kids, I read to them when they were little every night. I loved it. I don't know what they thought of it, but it was a joy for me. And as they got older and figured out that I was a writer of some kind, they started asking me to write a book for them. And they meant, you know, an adventure book or maybe some wizards or time travel, maybe a talking pig, something like that. And I tried a few times, and I can't do fiction. I need some facts to
concrete.
lead me along.
Anne, did you have a question? Did somebody? Barbara?
Yes, I was wondering, you wrote this after Charlie died.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have notes? I mean,
Yeah.
how do you go about writing a book about someone that you knew for quite a few years?
Right. Excellent question. Did I have notes from my conversations? Did I keep a journal? No. I got lucky, is the answer to that question. Charlie's family, when he was, you know, after he had turned 100, found an oral historian in Kansas City who had created a business of exactly this, going into homes with grandparents or great-grandparents and interviewing them and recording their life stories. And they had done this. Charlie sat with her for ultimately 3 hours. They were in 1-hour segments. She was a very skilled interviewer, terrific, kept him on point, and so I had access to those. And there was nothing in there that I had not personally heard him say. He'd told me all those stories, some of them many times. But to have that, his voice, it would have been very hard to write the book without that.
Mm.
Here's one over here.
I loved your use of philosophy. Did you come to the book with a deep knowledge of philosophy, or did you gain some of this during the writing?
Did I have a knowledge of philosophy before I wrote the book? I have a degree in philosophy. I wouldn't say I have a deep knowledge of philosophy. Yeah.
There you go.
So.
That's great. We have.
I just wondered, with all the change that Charlie went through, whether it was incremental or, you know, a huge change.
Yeah.
His attitude always seemed positive. You talked about the choice, obviously, he made, but was he conscious that he made that choice every time, or did he not ever get down, or?
Oh, the question is, did he ever get down? And how conscious was he of how he was going to approach the world? He definitely got down. And if you read the book, he had a horribly unhappy first marriage. Both of them were unhappy, neither one to blame, I don't think, but that marriage ultimately ended in his wife's death, either intentional or an accidental overdose. A lot of misery attached to that. His second marriage was very brief, but also ended unhappily. So he didn't have what you'd call a happy marriage until he was in his 50s. I do think it was conscious in the sense that I once asked him if he thought he was happy, and he said, never really thought about it. And he said, but we never had time to be sad. So it was a conscious way to sort of take that off the table. And I discuss in the book, one of the things I do is that every life is a mixture of happy and sad, good and bad. You know, I don't mean to, I'm not trying to condescend or patronize. You all know that.
Yeah.
But what strikes me is that, and you use the word storyteller in the introduction. That's the only thing I know how to do in life, is sometimes really rambly stories. But we construct a story about ourselves from that good and bad, that highs and lows. And it really is a decision. Mm-hmm. Are we going to tell the happy version of our story, present ourselves to the world, or are we going to tell an unhappy version? And I think Charlie really got that. What he loved about his stories, he would talk about his unhappy marriage, but what he preferred was, we've heard so many great Charlie stories after the book came out, so they're not in the book, but we live among people who knew him or their parents knew him. And one of my favorites, so classic, is a guy was driving down the street and saw Charlie out on his bicycle. He was 103. And he rolled down his car window and said, "Hey, Charlie, Dr. White, how you doing?" And Charlie said, "It's the best day of my life."
Aww, it's great.
So, yeah, I think ultimately it is a choice. Yeah. I've started, since I knew Charlie, I've started this exercise where when I wake up in the morning, put my feet on the floor, sitting on the edge of the bed, I stop, not for a long time, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and just think about great stuff that's either going on or that has recently happened or that I'm looking forward to. And it's just a way of framing the mind at the beginning of the day. And I'm not on cloud nine all day, but I've at least started out on the right foot.
Yeah. We have a lot of questions out here. Let me just see how we're doing on time. I think we have time for one more, David. And then we're going to do some book signing, if that's okay with you. Over here.
I'm not sure this is worthy of being the one more. What kind of sense of humor did he have? Was that a part of his life?
Yeah, asking about Charlie's sense of humor. It was robust. He loved to laugh. It was earthy, I mean, his humor was not highly philosophical, I'd say. I'll give you one example. Charlie was part of a medical mission in the 1950s to go operate on the president of Peru. Harry Truman was president of the United States. His White House physician was from Kansas City. And when the president of Peru said, "I need surgery on my hand, but I'm afraid to leave because there'll be a coup if I'm gone," Truman said, "Well, I'll send my White House physician down there to do that." and not everyone in the Kansas City medical community was sure that that was the right surgeon to send. And so Charlie said, oh, I'll go do your anesthesia. He ultimately became an anesthesiologist, retrained during the war. I'll go do your anesthesia, but we're going to take my surgeon friend with us. Turned out to be a pretty minor surgery, and the White House doctor was able to do it. And the president was so grateful that he sent a Peruvian Navy ship to take the 3 doctors on a voyage up the Amazon River. So they're way up the Amazon River. They're tromping around with their machetes and playing explorer. And they reach a little village where a guy is selling little capuchin monkeys. And so Charlie buys a monkey and names his after the surgeon friend that he took. So his monkey is named Bill Duncan. Bill Duncan buys a monkey. His is named Charlie White. That kind of captures his sense of humor. Charlie kept his monkey till it died, which will tell you this was during his period as a single man. Bill Duncan's did not last long after his wife got a look at it. But he liked to drive around in his convertible with the monkey in the car, and there was a fruit stand near the plaza where he would stop and say, "Can my boy have an apple?" You know, just goofy stuff like that.
Well, David, I just want to say this book of Charlie is a sleeper in a way because it's so small, but it's so filled with so much. And just listening to you today, it's just been a joy hearing your stories.
Well,
thank you so much,
you very
David.
much. Thank you for listening. I know my publisher would want me to say that though it's small, it's very gift-sized.
That's right.
Yeah. So
Yeah, it's a good gift.
It's a good gift size. I'm always reluctant to give people fat books because it's like you're assigning them homework. But if this comes, this little thing, then that doesn't look so bad.
And you know what I love about it? All the good conversations that have happened.